He was a man of faith, a father of 3 daughters, and a pillar of Detroit's Black Muslim community. He wasn't just respected, he was revered. His sermons echoed through the halls of Masjid al-Salam with power and conviction. A man who preached purity, family values, and discipline. A man others turned to for guidance, for truth, for leadership. But behind the flowing robes and righteous words was a storm no one saw coming. A quiet, cold fury buried beneath years of control and carefully crafted image. And when a single letter, anonymous, venomous, found its way into the mosque, everything began to unravel. It started with suspicion, a whisper in the shadows. Then came the DNA test, cloaked under the guise of routine health screening. A lie to cover a deeper fear. When the results came back, he didn't scream. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, gripping the envelope in one hand and a blade in the other. "Whose are they?" he asked. Just a whisper, just enough for his wife to know that her world, their world, was about to collapse. What drives a man to slaughter his own family? What happens when ego, religion, and betrayal collide in a house built on silence and secrets? Before we dive into this haunting case, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more chilling cases, where we unravel the darkest tales of love, lies, and lethal consequences. In the heart of Detroit's West Side, nestled within a neighborhood rich in culture, history, and faith, stood a mosque known as Masjid al-Salam. It wasn't the largest mosque in the city, nor the most modern, but to those who attended it, it was sacred ground. This was a community defined by unity, tradition, and reverence, where elders were honored, family was paramount, and religious leadership was rarely questioned. At the center of it all was Imam Rashid Karim. At 48 years old, Rashid was more than a spiritual leader. He was a symbol of unwavering discipline. A man with a deep baritone voice that seemed to shake the walls when he delivered sermons on purity, on obedience, on the sanctity of the Muslim household. To his congregation, he was righteous, wise, eloquent, a moral compass in an increasingly chaotic world. When he walked the streets, people lowered their gaze out of respect. When he spoke, others listened, without interruption, without doubt. But at home, it was a different story. Behind the locked doors of the Karim household, Rashid ruled not with compassion, but with control. His word was law, his silence, punishment. He had a way of weaponizing scripture, bending it to reinforce his authority and reinforce obedience. His obsession with reputation wasn't just about how others saw him. It was about keeping every thread of his world tightly in his grasp. His wife, Samira, now 45, was once a spirited, intelligent woman. They met when Rashid was studying abroad in Egypt in his 20s. She had dreams of becoming a scholar herself. But those dreams faded as she stepped into the role Rashid had carved out for her: quiet, devout, compliant. She became the keeper of his home, the mother of his children, the silent backbone of a life built on appearances. Together, they raised 3 daughters. Nadia, the eldest at 18, was graceful and obedient, always walking one step behind her father in public, always mindful of her gaze. Sophia, 16, was sharp and observant, often internalizing the tension that simmered beneath their family's polished surface. And Huda, just 13, was still wide-eyed, still holding on to slivers of childhood wonder in a house where innocence didn't last long. They were homeschooled, rarely allowed outside without a chaperone. No social media, no unsupervised friendships. The girls were raised with structure, yes, but also isolation. Rashid didn't trust the outside world. He said he was protecting them from corruption, but in truth, it was about control. To outsiders, the Karims were a model family, devoted, disciplined, unblemished. But the walls of that home knew otherwise. Behind the polite smiles and coordinated Eid photos, there was a deep, unspoken tension. The girls spoke to one another in hushed tones. Samira rarely made eye contact when her husband entered the room. And Rashid, he watched everything, said little, and expected total compliance. There was no room for mistakes, no room for deviation, only rules, only order. But even in the most pristine homes, secrets fester. And one rumor, just one, would soon tear this house apart. It began with a letter, plain, unmarked, left discreetly at the entrance of Masjid al-Salam just after the Far prayer, when the sky was still dim and the streets hushed in reverence. One of the mosque's elders picked it up, assuming it was another plea for charity or a request for counsel. But when he opened it and began to read, the blood drained from his face. It was addressed not to the Imam himself, but to the Shura, the council of elders who quietly governed the moral compass of their community. And the words inside were a grenade. None of Imam Rashid Karim's daughters are biologically his. No signature, no direct accusation, just a single sheet of paper typed in a cold, sterile font. It spoke of betrayal cloaked in piety, of lies rooted deep within the walls of the Karim household. The source of this claim? A man the community had not seen in years, a former friend of Rashid's, excommunicated after a bitter falling out over money, leadership, and pride. He was dismissed long ago as a liar, a rebel, a lost soul. But now his words struck a chord that couldn't be ignored. The elders didn't want scandal. They folded the letter and quietly passed it to Rashid after Jumu'ah that Friday, offering no commentary, no judgment, just cautious eyes watching for his reaction. Rashid read it once, then again. He said nothing, not in the mosque, not to the elders. He slipped the letter into his pocket, bowed his head in thanks, and walked to his car. When he got home that night, the house was quiet. The girls were upstairs reciting Quran. Samira was preparing dinner, humming softly to herself. She didn't notice the shift in his eyes, the stiffness in his walk, the storm forming just behind his calm. He didn't explode. No slaps, no shouting. Not yet. Instead, he approached her with surgical calm, told her he had read a medical article about recessive genetic conditions and how important it was to test the girls for certain markers, just in case. Said he was being proactive, protective, responsible, a good father. Samira, shaped by decades of submission, did not question him. Her heart raced, but she nodded. Of course, she whispered. The next week, he took the girls to a private clinic. He was meticulous. He ensured the test would include paternity verification, hidden within a broader panel of health screenings. Samira asked no further questions. The girls, curious but trusting, obeyed. Then the waiting began. 3 weeks, 21 days. At first, Rashid said little. He still attended his sermons, still greeted his neighbors. But behind closed doors, he began to unravel. He'd sit in his study for hours, rocking slowly in his chair, the letter lying flat on his desk like a curse. His nights became sleepless. He paced the halls after midnight, checking doors, staring out the windows. Watching. Always watching. Samira felt the shift in him, the way his voice grew colder, the way he no longer prayed beside her. He stopped speaking to the girls altogether. And though he never said it aloud, something in him had already changed. A suspicion had lodged itself in his brain like a splinter, and it was festering. Paranoia crept into everything. He replayed memories of each pregnancy. The timing. The way Samira looked at him in certain seasons. He began dissecting every moment of affection, every whispered phone call, every late-night glance. He questioned the girls' faces, wondering if their eyes were truly his. Their features began to blur into strangers' shadows. The house fell into silence. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, the envelope arrived. Thin, clinical. The results. He locked himself in the study to read them. And when he did, the room went still. Nadia, Sophia, Huda. Not one of them. Not even the youngest. Not even Huda. Rashid sat alone in that chair for almost 2 hours, staring at the paper. A father undone. A man of God, unraveling. And as the sun rose that day over the city of Detroit, something in him broke. Because what do you do when everything you built was a lie? And what do you become when the truth is too shameful to bear? Rashid decided to confront Samira. It was just after midnight. The house was asleep, at least it seemed that way. The girls had gone to bed hours earlier, tucked in beneath the soft glow of their bedroom lamps. Samira, in her cotton prayer dress, stood in the kitchen rinsing out a glass, her motion slow, almost mechanical. The silence felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something they couldn't name. Rashid stood in the doorway, the envelope in his hand. He didn't speak at first, just watched her, quietly, eyes unreadable. Samira turned, startled to find him there, and offered a gentle smile. But he didn't smile back. Instead, he walked into the room and placed the envelope on the table with a quiet finality. Then, almost tenderly, he pulled out a chair and sat. "Whose are they?" he asked, softly. So soft, she almost didn't hear it. But she did. Her hands froze midair. The glass slipped slightly from her grasp and tapped the edge of the sink. She turned to look at him, and in that instant, she knew. The tests, the results, the lie unraveling. Rashid didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He just sat there, as still as stone, waiting. Samira's knees gave way beneath her. She stumbled back into the wall, her breath shallow, hands trembling. I never meant for it to go that far," she whispered. Rashid's eyes didn't move. He was listening. That was worse than shouting. "It was years ago, during your retreats," she said, the words spilling out like a dam had finally broken. "You would leave for weeks, seeking solitude with the scholars. I was alone, and he was there. He, not even a name at first. Just a shadow." "Who?" Rashid asked. She hesitated, then said it. "Yusuf." Rashid flinched. Barely, but it was there. Yusuf, his closest friend, his spiritual brother, the man who once led Dyke beside him in the mosque. The same man he defended in front of the community before Yusuf was cast out in disgrace. Samira's voice cracked as she continued. "I was weak. I was lonely. And he was kind. One time turned into more. I thought it would end. But by then..." She didn't have to finish. He knew. "All three," he said, his voice hollow. She nodded, shame flooding her face. "Yes." The silence that followed stretched into something suffocating. Rashid leaned back in his chair. His hands were steady now. But it was the kind of stillness that came just before a storm, unnatural, cold. His eyes locked onto a crack in the ceiling, as if searching for divine intervention, or maybe just a place to disappear. His mind was no longer his own. It raced through years of memories, Nadia's birth, Safiya's first words, put his tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. Samira stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Rashid, please." He looked at her, finally looked at her. But it wasn't her face he saw anymore. It was betrayal, personified. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for corrupted. His sermons, his reputation, his daughters. None of it belonged to him. He was not a man anymore. Not a father. Not a husband. Just a fool. And in his eyes, there was only one way to make it right. To restore honor. To cleanse what had been defiled. He stood up slowly, pushed in the chair, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Samira remained frozen, her mouth open, unable to move or scream. She didn't know what he would do next. She didn't know that in Rashid's mind, judgment had already been passed. And so, before the call to prayer would echo across Detroit, Rashid Karim would become judge, jury, and executioner. The clock ticked, its rhythm the only sound in the stillness of the house. Outside, the first light of dawn was creeping across the horizon, but inside, the world had already turned to darkness. In the quiet hours of the night, as the city of Detroit slept, Rashid Karim moved through his home like a predator, his steps soft but purposeful. The air was thick with tension, each movement deliberate, as though he was carrying out some twisted form of destiny. Nadia, the eldest, lay in her bed, her long hair spread out like a dark halo. The cool night air brushed against her skin as she slept, unaware of the presence in her room. Rashid stood over her, a shadow in the dim light, his breath shallow but controlled. His hands were steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. He reached for the prayer shawl, the one he always used during his early morning prayers. Slowly, almost reverently, he draped it over her face. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't stir. Her mind was somewhere between dream and reality. Then, in a swift, practiced motion, Rashid pressed the fabric tighter, smothering her. The struggle was faint, a few gasps for air before it went quiet. He didn't wait for her body to relax before he drew the kitchen knife from its sheath. The blade sank into her chest with precision. There was no scream, no final cry for help. Just the sickening sound of flesh meeting steel, and Nadia's body went limp. He stood over her, unmoving for a moment. The weight of what he had just done didn't hit him. Not yet. His gaze lingered on her pale face, her body still, the reality of his actions still distant. Next, he moved down the hallway, silent in his approach. Sophia's room was just around the corner, her breathing soft and even, the rhythm of a child at peace. But peace wouldn't last long in this house. Rashid was already in the room, watching her for a moment, the anger slowly boiling back to the surface. She shifted in her sleep, her eyes fluttering open as a shadow loomed over her. She screamed in involuntary reaction, raw and terrified. It was the only sound she could make before Rashid's hand covered her mouth, and his knife was already at her throat. The slice was clean, too clean. A surgical precision, the kind of precision only someone who had been meticulously planning this could have. Her body went slack instantly, her life pouring out of her like a river of blood. Rashid didn't look back. The sound of Sophia's body hitting the bed was drowned out by his next target. Huda, the youngest, heard the noise, the scream, the scuffle, and she did what any terrified child would do. She ran. Her heart pounded in her chest, her small feet slapping against the wooden floor as she fled for her life. The hallway blurred around her as she tried to escape, but she was too slow. Rashid reached her in seconds, his hand grabbing hold of her thick braids, yanking her to the ground. Her body slammed against the hard floor, and for a moment, she gasped for breath, disoriented, eyes wide with panic. But that wasn't the end of it. Rashid lifted her easily, his grip tight around her braids, and hurled her down the stairs. The sickening sound of her body bouncing against each step echoed through the house. She groaned, barely able to move, but there was no mercy in his eyes. The hammer in his hand was the last thing she would ever see. He brought it down with force again and again, until the scream stopped, and Huda's body lay in a pool of blood at the bottom of the staircase. Then he turned. He knew she would be the last. He knew Samira was waiting to see what he would do next. But this was a man who had already made his choice. The blood of his daughters was no more than a necessary sacrifice. Now, only Samira remained, the woman who had betrayed him. The woman whose confession had ripped apart everything he believed in. She had known the consequences. She had known what he was capable of. And yet, she still dared to hide from him. He found her in the bathroom, crouched down beside the toilet, clutching the phone to her ear. Her hands trembled as she tried to dial 911, but her fear rendered her useless. The trembling grew more frantic as Rashid kicked in the door, the sound of splintering would reverberating through the house. She screamed, but it was too late. He dragged her out of the bathroom by the hijab, the fabric pulling at her hair, but she didn't fight. She couldn't. Tears blurred her vision as he forced her to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. His hand gripped her wrist as he spun her around. "Recite the verse," he ordered, his voice cold and empty. She opened her mouth, but her words were a whisper, shaking, filled with terror. It was a desperate attempt to appease him, to make it stop. But there was no stopping what had already begun. Rashid didn't wait for her to finish. He didn't care. He slashed her wrists, the blade cutting cleanly through her skin. She gasped in pain, her body shaking as the blood spilled from her veins, staining the white tiles beneath them. He watched, unmoving, as she bled out, her life slipping away, her pleas swallowed by the silence of the room. By the time the first call to prayer echoed through the neighborhood, Rashid was already gone. The house was silent. No voices, no screams. Just the soft drip of blood, pooling across the floor, staining the memory of what had once been a family. By dawn, the house was silent. A man once seen as God's shepherd had turned his home into a slaughterhouse. The world would never know the terror that unfolded here in the dark. And for the rest of his life, Rashid would have to live with the knowledge that he had destroyed everything he once held dear. 2 days later, it was a typical morning at Masjid al-Salam. The sound of the call to prayer echoed through the neighborhood, drawing the faithful from their homes to the mosque. But today, something felt off. Rashid Karim, the Imam who had always been the first to arrive for far prayer, was nowhere to be seen. His absence was unusual, unsettling. By midday, the unease among the community members had grown. They had seen Rashid as a pillar of strength and faith, a man whose presence was as much a part of the mosque as the very walls themselves. His silence, now deafening, had caused whispers to spread. "Where is he?" they asked. "What happened to the Imam?" One by one, members of the mosque began knocking on the door of the Karim household, hoping to find answers. They knocked again and again, but no one answered. An ominous silence hung in the air, and a sinking feeling took root in their hearts. Something wasn't right. Finally, after several attempts, the door creaked open, but the scene that greeted them was something they would never forget. The air was thick with the stench of death. The first thing they noticed was the blood, streaks of it, smeared across the hallway, pooling at the foot of the stairs. It was a path of carnage, leading them deeper into the house, as though the blood itself had told the story of what had unfolded here. Then they saw it. A body, Nadia's, lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, her lifeless eyes staring blankly into space, her neck slit open. At the foot of the stairs, they saw Samira. Her body was twisted unnaturally, a lifeless form crumpled against the wall. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in an eternal expression of terror, as though she had seen the face of her own executioner and had known in that moment that there would be no escape. And why had he left behind this scene of unspeakable horror? The community immediately contacted the authorities, but there was no sign of Rashid. He had vanished without a trace, slipping into the woods behind the mosque as though he had become part of the shadows. The woods were dense, the trees thick with the remnants of a long, harsh winter. But even in the wild, Rashid could not hide forever. Days passed, and with each hour, the manhunt grew more desperate. Then, on the third day, a search party found him. He was barely conscious, his clothes tattered, his body gaunt and covered in dirt. He had been wandering aimlessly, delirious, lost in the woods behind Masjid, mid-suicide attempt. But it was what he had done to himself that terrified them most. There, in the quiet isolation of the woods, Rashid had carved a word into his chest, a word that seemed to scream of his madness, his obsession, his broken mind. Zanaya. The word was an accusation. It meant adulteress, a label he had placed on his wife, Samira, in a final act of twisted self-righteousness. The word was his own confession, his own declaration that he believed his actions were justified, that the bloodshed had been necessary to cleanse his household of sin. When they finally managed to bring him back to civilization, Rashid was in no condition to answer any questions. His mind, once so sharp and commanding, had crumbled under the weight of his actions. His body was broken, his spirit shattered, and his eyes were empty, as though he had lost any semblance of the man he once was. But still, the question lingered in the air. Why? Why had Rashid done it? Why had he slaughtered his own family? Was it truly about the betrayal, the affair, the bloodlines that no longer matched his own? Or was it something deeper, something more twisted, buried beneath layers of piety and obsession? And even if he could explain himself, would it ever be enough? The authorities were left to piece together the grisly details of what had transpired, but they knew that no explanation would ever be sufficient. Rashid Karim had once been a respected leader, a man who had commanded the respect of his community, but now he was a shadow of his former self, lost, broken, and hunted by his own actions. The question now wasn't whether Rashid did it, but why? And would he ever show remorse? Would he ever seek redemption? Or had he crossed a line that even he could not come back from? As the investigation unfolded and the community grappled with the aftermath, the chilling reality began to set in. A man who had preached about purity, about faith, about obedience, had now become the very embodiment of the darkness he had once warned others about. And the world would never be the same again. Then came the trial. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, the weight of the case hanging heavy in the air. Rashid Karim sat motionless in his chair, his eyes cold and unblinking, as though he had become a mere shell of the man he had once been. His once commanding presence now seemed almost ghostly, his body hollow, and his soul seemingly absent. The weight of the crime, the brutality of his actions, had left him numb, or perhaps indifferent. There was no sorrow, no remorse in his gaze, only a quiet defiance that seemed to consume him from the inside out. When his turn came to speak, Rashid did not offer a single word of explanation, nor did he acknowledge the horror that had unfolded in his own home. Instead, he recited Quranic verses. "I purify my bloodline," he would say, his voice barely more than a whisper, repeating it like a mantra, as though that one phrase could justify the unthinkable. The defense team clung to this, arguing that Rashid had been driven to commit the murders by spiritual psychosis, that he had believed he was carrying out a divine command to cleanse his family, to rid them of the impurity that had tainted his bloodline. But the prosecution had a different view. They painted a far darker picture of Rashid, a man driven not by madness, but by his need for control, by his ego, by his obsession with purity and status. They argued that his actions were not the result of a psychotic break, but of cold, calculating rage. Rashid had been the patriarch of his household, the unquestioned leader of his family, and when that sense of control was threatened, he had acted with lethal precision. His need for power had driven him to slaughter those he once claimed to protect, all in the name of preserving an image of purity that was no more than a mask. As the trial wore on, the jury heard testimony from experts, from family members, from the community. They heard how Rashid had once been a man of respect, a man of faith. They heard how that same man had become a murderer, driven by the very ideals that had once made him a beacon of virtue. But no one could answer the question that lingered over the entire trial. What had truly happened to Rashid Karim? What had turned this man of faith into a killer? The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Finally, the verdict was read. Rashid Karim would spend the rest of his life in prison, without the possibility of parole. His actions, his cold, calculated murders, could not be excused by insanity. The law had spoken. As the gavel struck, Rashid's lips moved again, though his words were more chilling than any could have anticipated. He didn't speak of remorse. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he whispered, "A man has no bloodline when he has no truth." I buried the lie. The man who had once preached salvation had now condemned himself to a lifetime of solitude and silence, trapped in a prison of his own making. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of his words echoed in the minds of all who had witnessed the trial. Rashid Karim, the Imam who had once stood as a pillar of faith, had fallen. His legacy, tarnished by his actions, would never be the same. And for a man who had devoted his life to guiding others towards salvation, there was nothing left but the silence of his own damnation. And so, the question remained, in a world where faith can both uplift and destroy, could a man who had preached truth ever find his way back from the darkness he had created? Or had he crossed a line from which there would be no return? This story isn't just about betrayal or bloodlines. It's about the darkness that grows when image becomes more sacred than truth. When pride overshadows faith, even family is no longer safe. Was this the act of a madman, or a murderer who used religion to justify the unforgivable? If this story left you stunned, subscribe for more harrowing tales where love, lies, and legacy collide in the most terrifying ways.